really happy to be here talking about poetry because it's my favorite form of literature. And so I'll begin by telling you that it's no different from other forms of communication. If you have seen love letters, read jokes, listened to conversations, given advice, asked for help, you would be familiar with exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I talk about the forms of poetry. What makes poetry the same as these forms of communication? What makes it same is that everything is connected to our lives. It's human communication, it has human origins. So you make sense of a poem exactly the way in which you make sense of these forms of communication. The words, the experience that you share, help you get beyond the lines into the life and into the meaning that you have to see beyond them. So it's not difficult, it's not just for the literary circle, but the forms of poetry can be understood and enjoyed by all. Why do we have forms of poetry? For the same reason that we have the other forms of communication, that in order to make others understand, we have to structure our meaning. And just to make this point a little clearer, I would like to read you just a few lines from my favorite poem, Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. Listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling, at their return, up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin, with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. This poem is a lyric. It's about feeling, it's about meditation, reflection. It's also about resolving some spiritual conflict. But look at the language here. The language here enacts the meaning that the poet wishes to make. He's asking you to listen, and when you listen, grating roar is exactly the kind of sound that you hear if you stand by the seashore. And when you look at the next line, of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling, you can almost imagine yourself picking up a pebble, the muscular effort of drawing it back and flinging it. So the structure of the lines, the sound of the words, the pattern of associations, whatever little imagery there is here, and also the suggestion of the ebb and flow of the seawater on the seashore is all suggested to you in these lines. So if these lines have worked for Matthew Arnold, then that is the reason why poets have developed structured forms to make their meaning clear. And also as you go by and the developed forms of literature come in, you find that forms are created because of the need to express from within. So I won't be far wrong if I compare the forms of poetry, their relationship to meaning, by comparing it to the apparel we choose. We don't choose apparel simply because we want to conform. We also choose apparel to make a statement about ourselves, to show that we are different. So you will find as we go along that there are forms of poetry that are objective and there are forms of poetry that are subjective. The objective forms of poetry deal with the outside world. They comment on the way the poet views what is happening outside him and around him. And subjective poetry chooses forms that express what goes on within, what happens inside with the emotions and the feelings and the attempt to understand the way things happen in the human world. So I'll take you on from here to one of the most standard objective forms of poetry. And you would be familiar with this form as the epic. There is no country in this world, I think, that doesn't understand epic. Epic is all about the grand spectacle of the world. We've had epics even before we had writing. Yes, in India we have the Mahabharata, and in England, the first written epic, I think, to make its mark was Milton's grand work, Paradise Lost. Now, what is the formal element of the epic? First thing is the epic has to be about somebody really great. Of course, Paradise Lost is about God himself, about Adam, and about how he created this world. And like the poet himself says, it is an attempt, it is a Herculean task to justify the ways of God to men. So all epics are like this. If you're talking about Homer's Iliad, if you're talking about the Mahabharata, they're all like this. They have certain conventions, certain prerequisites that makes them recognizable as epics. The first point here is we must have a hero whom we all admire. So you have a setting which is ample in scale. Paradise Lost covers earth, covers Garden of Eden, and covers hell, and covers heaven. The action also must involve not just noble humans, but supernatural beings, superhuman beings, and sometimes gods themselves. You have Adam, you have God, you have Christ, and you have the fallen angels, you have Satan, you have all the people who usually occupy a place much above your realm of experience in this world. Now, because of the content of the epic, you won't be surprised to hear that the language cannot be the language of informal speech. It cannot be the language even of simplicity. It has to be grand and elevated, full of detail. It has to be a grand spectacle as well. So you have what is called the epic simile, you have comparisons which are very detailed, and you just have to open to any page of Paradise Lost to see that epic similes can run into about nearly 20 to 25 lines sometimes. Now, what are the other conventions? An epic usually begins with an invocation to a muse. No poet can write an epic without external help, external agency. So the invocation to a muse or a guiding spirit. And to make it really grand and dramatic, an epic never begins with an introduction. It always begins in the thick of the action, in medias res, as we call it. So you find that Paradise Lost begins with the fallen angels trying to collect an army for a war with God's angels. And the actual story leading up to the fall is given much later in books 4 and 5 of Paradise Lost. So an epic always begins in the middle. Now, there are catalogues of principal characters, and these catalogues run into beautiful descriptions of the numbers of heroes, demigods, titans, supernatural beings that you find. The epic is a beautiful world to lose yourself in. There's never a dull moment. From the epic, we go on to the ode. The ode is also serious. The ode is elevated, and it has an elaborate stanza structure. The ode has its origin in Greece, and we owe the origin of the ode to Pindar. Now, he was responsible for the formation of the chorus in Greek drama. Now, as you know, this is a public performance, and the chorus consisted of people who positioned themselves in a certain way and moved to the chanting of certain lines. So the strophe, they moved to the right, the antistrophe to the left, and for the epode, they stood still. The English ode has developed from the Pindaric ode, and the only thing that they have done here is, because it's not a part of drama and it's a part of poetry, they have frozen the strophes and they have organized into a complicated stanza form. So in the English Pindaric ode, the best example of that is Thomas Gray's Progress of Poesy. What they have done is they have a very irregular structure, and they have frozen the strophe, antistrophe, and epode all into one stanza. All right. Now, Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, again, it's an ode about problems and solving problems in life, in searching for yourself, in locating your real self. So Wordsworth's Immortality Ode develops a stanza which begins like an ode, but then becomes very, very irregular and loose. There is another ode which is unlike the Immortality Ode or the Dejection Ode by Coleridge, or even Ode to a Nightingale by Keats. and that's Keats's Ode to Autumn. Seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness. There's less drama here. There is none of the passion that you find in the earlier Pindaric ode, because this takes after Horace, the Horatian ode, and the best example of this is Keats's Ode to an Autumn. And the main identifying feature of this ode is that it is very calm, very reflective, and it allows for a slow and calm progress right to the end of the poem. Another very public, very objective form of poetry is the ballad. But the ballad was never written. Usually the ballads are never written, but now of course we have published ballads. And what is a ballad? A ballad is a song transmitted orally. It tells a story, it's dramatic and impersonal, it has action and dialogue, and it has a stanza form. It is a quatrain, and it alternates the rhyme A, B, C, B. And if you listen to a ballad, for example, the ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, "The king sat in Dunfermline town drinking his blood-red wine," the phrase "the blood-red wine" keeps coming up again and again. Now this is typical of the ballad. It has refrains, they're stock descriptive phrases. "Where have you been, Lord Randall, my son?" I mean, these things are repeated again and again. Sometimes in some later ballads, you have what is called an incremental refrain. The line is repeated, but for the sake of meaning, for the sake of embellishment, for the sake of impact, a little more is added to the stock phrase that is repeated again and again. With the ballad, what you find is a little bit of the inner landscape also comes in. I mean, this is natural because it's a spoken and dramatic form, and each singer, each recitation of the ballad adds to the ballad and its meaning. I'm sure people used to extempore, and the meaning of ballads, no one ballad has one form. There are variations of the ballad form because of its original form as spoken poetry. I'll move from the ballad to another very objective form of poetry, once again because it deals with events, people, stories, narratives outside. Now, I'm talking about the satire. The satire has less to do with storytelling, like the epic and the ballad. It has more to do with looking at the world, looking at an ideal of the world, and seeking to correct what is wrong in this world. So once again, this is about being objective, and soon when I start giving you examples, you will find that the major number of examples of the satire are from the 18th century or the Restoration period in literature. Now, this happens because it's the age of order, it's the age of reason, and the reason that seeks to perfect the imperfections, correct the follies and vices in society and in the world order, especially as it relates to people and human beings. So what is the satire? Satire ridicules and evokes attitudes of amusement, contempt, indignation or scorn. In formal satire, the voice speaks in the first person. You have, for example, Pope's essays. You have his epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, which brings out a very interesting feature of satire, because when there is a person who speaks, there is an imagined person either within the poem or outside the poem, an adversary. Dr. Arbuthnot is the adversary to whom Pope speaks. So it is important that there is this other to whom the satiric poet addresses himself. The character of the persona and the tone he manifests towards his adversary are very, very important for the satire. The importance is that the satire originates from Horace and Juvenal, and there's a difference in the tone that the persona in each of these satires adopts. For example, the speaker in the Horatian satire is very urbane, very witty, very tolerant of human folly. He uses relaxed and informal language. You find that he blames not really the person, but the folly. and the fault. And he never addresses himself to anything that is not corrigible. So you can only correct what can be corrected. What cannot be corrected, you have no grip over. The satire of Juvenal, on the other hand, has the speaker in a very serious and moralizing tone, using very dignified and a public style, very public style, to evoke moral indignation at a more serious vice, more serious folly. And I think Dr. Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes is really the best example of Juvenalian satire. I come from here to the idyll or the pastoral, and before I talk about it, I want you to have a look at this picture for just a minute. The idyll or the pastoral expresses a nostalgic image of idealized setting. So you can see that a picture book setting is literally what is the backdrop for the idyll or the pastoral. The idyll or the pastoral is an elaborately conventional poem. A shepherd reclining under a spreading beech tree and meditating and calling upon the rural muse. Shepherd piping as though time stood still. Shepherds engaging in a friendly singing contest. Expressing good or bad fortune to a lovely mistress. Grieving over the death of a fellow shepherd. Now, that is why the idyll or the pastoral convention finds that it can be treated in more than one way. Christopher Marlowe's Shepherd to His Beloved is a beautiful poem about the pastoral idyll, where you have a shepherd addressing his lady love. You also have the pastoral that is used for mourning the death of fellow shepherds. And again, I must go back to my favorite poet. Matthew Arnold's Thyrsis is written in this convention, where his friend Clough is seen as a fellow shepherd. And the main thing about a pastoral is that everything is nostalgia. It's a creation of mood. So slowly you find that the hard and fast lines between the objective and the subjective actually crumble in the pastoral, because it evokes mood. For example, when you looked at the picture, you longed to be there in those serene and beautiful surroundings. Similarly, that is the kind of atmosphere that the idyll or the pastoral tries to create. It's been used in English literature for various purposes, not just to celebrate love and nature, but also to reflect on themes regarding life. For example, Milton's Lycidas is a pastoral elegy, but he uses the pastoral elegy and its conventions to talk about the corruption that is there outside in the church and in society. So you find that the pastoral elegy or the pastoral poem is really a contrast between a simple life and a complicated life. Everything that is innocent, honest, simple is pastoral. So you have your modern pastorals as well. You have Alice in Wonderland, and Alice in Wonderland is really a kind of nostalgia for the lost innocence. I come from here to the elegy because I've spoken about the pastoral elegy, but I want to talk more about the elegiac conventions. Usually an elegy commemorates someone who's dead and also includes meditative poems. A formal and sustained poem of lament was something or someone lost, ending in a note of peace or even joy. For example, Tennyson's In Memoriam is a long elegy commemorating Arthur Hallam, his friend. And Tennyson wrote this just before his own wedding, and therefore the poem ends actually with an epithalamion, which is a poetic form that has marriage as its major subject. So something that ends in mourning and nostalgia for someone or something gone by can actually end in joy and peace and look forward to a new world and a new beginning. A pastoral elegy has conventions that I was talking about, And the Lycidas again is an example. If you open your poem to Lycidas by Milton, you will find each and every one of these conventions there. The lyric speaker begins with an invocation to the muses and refers to figures from classical myth. All nature joins in mourning the shepherd's death. The mourner charges guardians with negligence. There is a procession of mourners. The poet raises questions about the justice of divine progress, and here he uses a little digression. This is called a digression because he's left this pastoral scene for a short while to talk about the actual situation in his own country, in his own times, something that relates to him and to the people who are his contemporaries. So the question about justice or divine progress, for example, Lycidas is mourning for somebody who has been lost before his time, Edward King, who died well before his time. And it goes on to the corrupt conditions of his times. Then you find an elaborate decoration of the hearse with appropriate flowers. I mean, what is more befitting to a pastoral elegy than that nature should mourn and nature should bring her best yield, her best produce, and decorate the hearse of the lost person. And a pastoral elegy definitely ends with a closing consolation. All elegies, like I have said, end with a closing consolation. And if you read Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, you will find that in addition to commemorating the passing away of a person, you can use elegies to commemorate the passing away of a world order, the loss of values. In fact, Tennyson's Idylls of the King do that to quite a large extent. I come from here to much more subjectivized forms of poetry, and so I should, I suppose, naturally begin with the lyric. The elegiac form is also subjective. The lyric is uniquely subjective. Its origins are within, and it expresses emotion, and it is completely non-narrative. A lyric also includes expressions of a complex evolution of mind, such as in the long elegy or ode. So we've seen the ode, we have seen how Wordsworth, for instance, or Coleridge, for instance, use it to understand their concept of themselves. They use it to search for themselves. So it can be used to reflect, to follow the evolution of the mind. The process of observation, thought, memory, and feeling in a lyric may be organized in many ways. And for this, I'll just broadly divide. There are many lyrics. In fact, lyric is integral to a lot of poetry. So that was the lyric, and now we'll talk about the sonnet. The sonnet, again, is not grown on English soil. It has been brought in somewhere in the 16th century by Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey, and it's, of course, been perfected by Shakespeare. He didn't invent it, but one sonnet form is named after him. Now, the Shakespearean sonnet is the standard English sonnet. It is a 14-line poem in iambic pentameter, and it has a rhyme scheme of 3 quatrains rounded off by a couplet. So the rhyme scheme is like this: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Now, the English sonnet presents repetition with variation of the statement in 3 quatrains with an epigrammatic close in the final couplet. So the meaning is developed in the first 3 quatrains and it's resolved in the last couplet. And the couplet specially lends itself to this sort of a closure because a few years down the line, Pope is going to be using the couplet form, the heroic couplet form, to make his meaning. Now, Petrarch, who is actually the person who is responsible for the sonnet form. The Petrarchan, or the Italian sonnet, is a 14-line poem in iambic pentameter, divided into an octave, that is a set of 8 lines, and a sestet, a set of 6 lines. So the rhyme scheme of the octave is A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A, and a sestet that varies in its rhyme scheme. Now, the octave favors a statement of the problem, situation, or incident, and the resolution is usually developed in the sestet. The Spenserian sonnet links each quatrain to the next by a continuing rhyme scheme. Where Shakespeare kept his quatrains separate, Spenser took a rhyme from the earlier quatrain and linked it to the next quatrain. So the rhyme scheme of the Spenserian sonnet is A, B, BC, BC, CD, CD, EE. Now the subject matter of the sonnet was secular love, till of course Donne shifted to a variety of religious themes in his holy sonnets. Milton extended the range to other matters of serious contemplation. There are other forms of poetry that are very, very interesting, and probably I should mention the shape to the concrete poem. If anyone has read, for example, Alice in Wonderland, they'll have seen a little bit of this shaped poem in Alice in Wonderland, where the questions are formed like a question. They're written out in a question form. You have Easter Wings by George Herbert, and the entire poem, if you look at it, looks like a pair of butterfly wings. Then you have a Villanelle, which is actually a French poem. It has a recurring rhyme scheme with a repetition of whole lines, but it is not really like the ballad. And Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is a beautiful example of that. And then of course there's the limerick, and I think everyone likes a limerick, but they don't know that limerick is a 5-line comic poem rhyming A, B, B, A. And then there's the haiku, and I think Pound has written the most delightful things in this Japanese form. And there is the parody. There's a Clary Hugh, about Christopher Wren, talks about people. It's just a 4-line poem that talks about a person and his biography. And it's named after the man who invented it, Edmund Clary Hugh.